In the archives of medieval Europe lie stories so strange that even historians once refused to believe them. Before we begin this journey, take a moment. Subscribe to Echoes of Time, where we uncover the forgotten, the forbidden, and the truths that history tried to bury. Now, picture this. A dimly lit courtroom in the 14th century. A woman stands accused of witchcraft, her alleged crime, stealing men's private parts and keeping them as pets in a bird's nest, feeding them oats and corn. Across town, a pig is on trial for immoral relations with its owner. If convicted, both the man and the pig will burn together at the stake. And just beyond the square, in a state-licensed brothel, prostitutes with yellow hoods and tinkling bells prepare for the emperor's arrival, ready to capture him with golden chains as part of a ritualized welcome. This was medieval sexuality, a world so bizarre that later scholars simply pretended it never existed. Forget the myth of the chaste knight and the meek peasant. This was a civilization where courts ordered wives to prove their husband's potency in front of judges, where physicians prescribed orgasms as medicine, and where pregnancy after assault was used as proof that a woman had consented. These aren't rumors or exaggerations. They're written in court ledgers, legal decrees, and medical handbooks, all preserved by the very society that created them. You're about to enter a world where religion, law, and medicine collided to produce the strangest, most disturbing view of sex ever documented. Let's begin with the institution that controlled it all, the Catholic Church and its unrelenting hold over the medieval body. Imagine being married in the 13th century France. You love your spouse and wish to share a simple moment of intimacy. Seems innocent enough, but to the Church, it was a labyrinth of sin. A sexual calendar governed every act of affection. No sex on Sundays, the Lord's Day, not on Fridays, Christ's death. Thursdays were sacred to the Last Supper, Lent banned it for 40 days, Advent for another 4 weeks, and dozens of feast and fast days dotted the year like landmines. Even natural conditions were policed. If your wife was menstruating, forbidden. If she'd just given birth, untouchable for 40 days. Some priests even claimed that intimacy during breastfeeding would corrupt the milk and harm the child. One German penitential ordered 3 years of fasting on bread and water for any couple who dared ignore it. When scholars tallied every restriction, a properly obedient Christian couple could legally be intimate less than once a week. And even then, the rules for the act itself were suffocating. Only one position was sanctioned: missionary. Anything else was labeled sodomy, punishable by years of penance. Woman on top, 40 days. In the manner of dogs, 3 years. Any position impeding conception, 7 years. The Canons of Theodore, a 7th century manual still cited centuries later, declared that anyone who spilled seed in the mouth had committed a sin worse than murder. Even pleasure itself was treated as crime. Too much enjoyment, sin. Making noise, sin. Taking too long, sin. A French bishop even prescribed penance for couples who lingered in embraces or showed excessive affection. The ideal Christian encounter, according to these guides, was to be brief, silent, dutiful, and, as one line chillingly states, performed without pleasure, as if compelled by obligation alone. Yet while priests thundered against desire, they secretly funded it. Clergy frequented brothels so openly that the Church began taxing the behavior instead of banning it. It was called the collegium, a fornication fee. Pay your bishop a yearly sum, and keep your mistress in peace. Records from medieval England and Germany list these payments alongside the tithes and burial fees, standard income for the Church. In the Diocese of Norwich, around 1450, the collegium appeared between entries for baptisms and funerals. In some German regions, nearly a third of parish priests were paying it. Even monasteries, meant to be citadels of chastity, became infamous for scandal. And when the church confronted sexual sin inside its own walls, its punishments could be nightmarish. Consider the Nun of Wotton, documented by Aelred of Rievaulx in 12th century England. A young girl, forced into convent life as a child, became pregnant by a lay brother. When discovered, the other nuns captured her lover, dragged him before her, and ordered her to castrate him herself. Then, according to the chronicle, one senior nun took the severed organs and forced them into the girl's mouth, claiming it was an act of purification. Miraculously, the account says, her pregnancy vanished, interpreted as a divine sign. She was forgiven and allowed to remain in the convent. To them, this horror was not cruelty. It was spiritual cleansing. In a world ruled by sin and penance, violence itself became a form of absolution. If the church distorted morality, medieval medicine destroyed reason. Physicians inherited ancient Greek theories and turned them into dangerous law. They believed both men and women produced seed, and conception required both to climax, the two-seed theory. A 12th century scholar, William of Conches, even wrote that, without mutual pleasure and the emission of both seeds, generation cannot occur. That single belief warped justice for centuries. If conception required pleasure, then a pregnant victim of assault was automatically judged to have consented. The 13th century English legal text, Flater, stated plainly, if she conceived by the rape, the charge must be dropped, for without her consent, she could not conceive. The cruelty of that logic is staggering. A woman violated, and her own pregnancy used as evidence that she was lying. This wasn't a fringe idea. It was standard legal doctrine across Europe. Court records from England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire show rape charges dismissed on this basis. Lady Isabel Butler of 15th century Ireland was abducted, assaulted, and forced into marriage. When she conceived, the court ruled it couldn't have been rape. Her attacker kept her as his lawful husband. Meanwhile, the same physicians who wrote these laws were prescribing orgasms as medicine. They warned that women deprived of sexual release could suffer from wandering wombs or hysteria, a uterus believed to roam the body causing choking, fainting, and madness. Their cure? For married women, regular intercourse. For widows or virgins, manual stimulation by a midwife to release trapped vapors. In short, medicalized pleasure under the guise of treatment. Medieval Europe built a civilization obsessed with controlling desire, yet utterly enslaved by it. The church condemned it, the courts distorted it, and medicine exploited it, turning human intimacy into a battlefield of sin and science. But this was only the beginning. Because the same system that punished women for pleasure would soon unleash the Inquisition, where confession itself became an act of sexual domination. Subscribe to Echoes of Time, and in Part 2 we'll uncover how faith turned fear into fuel for the darkest trials in European history. This practice continued for centuries, and eventually gave birth to one of the strangest inventions of the modern age, the vibrator in the 1800s. But its roots stretch back to the Middle Ages, to the ancient theory of the wandering womb. Yet nothing captured the public spectacle of medieval sexuality quite like the trial by Congress. When a wife sought annulment claiming her husband was impotent, French courts demanded proof. Their solution? A live demonstration. The procedure was disturbingly formal. The couple would be escorted to a chamber, often inside a bishop's palace. A panel of older matrons, women considered experts in such matters, first inspected the husband, examining him for deformities and even attempting to test arousal. If that examination proved inconclusive, the court advanced to the main event. Behind curtains with small gaps for witnesses, the couple were ordered to attempt intercourse. The matrons watched for signs, erection, penetration, and completion, as if judging a grim ceremony instead of a marriage. The pressure was unbearable. In 1659, the Marquise de Langeais' case became the scandal of Paris. Pamphlets and poems mocked whether the Marquise could or couldn't perform. He failed spectacularly, again and again. Though years later, he remarried and fathered children, proving how absurd the system truly was. Court records describe him wilting like a flower under the matron's gaze, a man destroyed not by biology but humiliation. For other sexual offenses, the punishments were just as theatrical. Adultery was not a private shame, it was a public crime. Under the laws of King Canute in the 11th century England, an adulterous woman could have her nose and ears cut off. It wasn't random cruelty, it was symbolic annihilation. The nose represented beauty and status. Removing it destroyed a woman's face, a permanent mark branding her as sinful flesh. Archaeologists have uncovered female skulls showing such mutilations, proof that these laws weren't idle threats, but lived horrors. Still, few practices reveal the twisted logic of medieval justice more than the prosecution of animals. To the medieval mind, bestiality was the darkest of sins, worse than incest, worse than murder, for it blurred the line between human and beast. Both offender and animal faced death, usually by burning. But here's the truly surreal part. The animals were given trials. They had defense attorneys. Witnesses testified about their behavior. Verdicts were read aloud with solemn ceremony. Hundreds of such cases survive in legal archives. In 16th century France, a man named Jacques Ferrand was executed for relations with a donkey. But the donkey herself was acquitted after villagers swore she had been gentle, obedient, and clearly forced. The court ruled she showed no sign of complicity and returned her to her owner, while Ferrand burned at the stake. In other cases, the animals weren't so fortunate. A cow in Normandy burned alongside her owner. Pigs were especially targeted. In 1386, one pig was dressed in human clothing before execution, a grotesque reminder that it had shared in human sin. Such rituals were meant to purge towns of spiritual contamination through fire. Homosexuality drew equally fanatical persecution. Venice maintained drowning pools where accused men were tied between columns at high tide and left to die beneath the rising water. In Spain, the Cortes prescribed burning at the stake, but nowhere institutionalized the fear more systematically than Florence. In 1432, the city established the Office of the Knight, a secret police force tasked exclusively with hunting men accused of same-sex acts. Their methods were meticulous and chillingly bureaucratic. Patrols monitored known meeting places. Anonymous denunciations could be dropped into wooden boxes around the city. Young men were paid to act as bait. Over 70 years, the office investigated nearly 17,000 men, almost half of Florence's adult male population, and secured about 3,000 convictions. Records survive detailing who played the active or passive role, where they met, and how often. First offenders paid fines, repeat offenders faced branding, public pillory, or death. Whenever crisis struck, these sexual deviants became scapegoats. During the Black Death of the 1340s, terrified towns sought divine forgiveness by purging the impure. In Bruges, Jean Van Erdon was burned in 1348 because officials believed his unnatural lust had poisoned the air and unleashed the plague. Dozens met the same fate across Europe, each execution a desperate offering to a silent god. Even the mighty were not immune. The once revered Knights Templar, the warrior monks of Christendom, fell under similar accusations. When King Philip IV of France sought their destruction in 1307, he accused them of heresy and of obscene sexual rituals. Initiates, he claimed, were forced to kiss their masters' anuses and engage in orgies. The confessions wrung from tortured knights sealed their fate. Whether Philip believed it or not didn't matter, the public did. In the medieval mind, heresy and sexual deviance were inseparable. To defy God in thought was to defile the body in act. By the late Middle Ages, sexual fear had merged completely with supernatural terror. The Malleus Maleficarum, the infamous witch hunter's manual of 1487, reads less like theology and more like obsession. Its authors fixated on one recurring theme: sex. They claimed witches could steal men's genitals through sorcery. A typical passage reads, "Witches may truly and actually remove men's members, keeping many together, 20 or 30, in a bird's nest, where they move about and feed on oats and corn." One story told of a man who climbed a tree to retrieve his missing part from such a nest, only to be told the largest one belonged to the parish priest. Educated inquisitors believed it completely. Under torture, women confessed to impossible crimes and burned for them. Art followed belief. A 13th-century mural in Massa Marittima, Tuscany, depicts women harvesting penises from a tree-like fruit. A 14th-century illuminated manuscript shows a nun calmly plucking them and dropping them into a basket. To medieval eyes, this was not satire, but warning. The devil lurked in desire itself. Centuries later, myth-makers added new legends to the pile. Let's dismantle the most famous. The so-called droit du seigneur, a lord's right to sleep with peasant brides on their wedding night, is complete fiction. No credible medieval document ever granted such power. What did exist were marriage fees paid by serfs to their lords, later twisted by Enlightenment writers into scandalous tales to paint the past as barbaric. Chastity belts? Also fake. Every so-called example in museums has proven to be a 19th-century forgery or Renaissance gag. The earliest image appears in a 1405 military manual, alongside sketches of invisible armor and perpetual motion machines. It was satire, even noting duplicate keys for comic effect. What was real, however, were the municipal brothels, far stranger than the myths. Cities across Europe ran government-licensed houses of prostitution, often under church oversight. In Southwark, London, they were known as the Bishop of Winchester's geese, because the bishop both licensed and taxed them. He literally profited from prostitution while preaching chastity each Sunday. Regulations bordered on absurd. In Nuremberg, married men were forbidden to visit on Sundays. Pregnant prostitutes were suspended from service until after childbirth. Jewish clients were charged double. Distinctive uniforms were mandatory. Yellow hoods with bells in Leipzig, black cloaks with yellow stripes in Milan. When Emperor Frederick III entered Nuremberg in 1471, the city's prostitutes greeted him at the gates, capturing him playfully with golden chains as part of the official welcome. He laughed, paid a ransom, and joined the celebration. For a fleeting moment, sin and ceremony became one. Everything changed in 1494, when a new and terrifying disease appeared: syphilis. It spread from Naples through Europe in less than 2 years, leaving sores, rashes, and faces eaten by infection. Brothels that had flourished for centuries were shuttered overnight. What had been a pragmatic system of regulated vice collapsed instantly. Noble marriages dissolved at the first sign of lesions. Prostitutes were imprisoned in hospital wards. Fear replaced tolerance, and desire turned deadly. That was the final irony of medieval sexuality. For all its moral chaos and brutal laws, it had always acknowledged one truth: people would desire regardless of doctrine. So society built escape valves: confession, penance, marriage, and the brothel. Each grotesque punishment and absurd rule was an attempt to contain the uncontrollable. They failed, of course. But their failure left monuments, court records, penitentials, and the haunting marginal drawings of penis trees that survive in manuscripts. Through them, we glimpse a world at war with its own humanity, a civilization both terrified of and consumed by the power of sex. And that's the real story of the medieval mind. A society desperate to discipline desire, and in the process, revealing just how profoundly human it truly was. If this unsettling journey through medieval intimacy fascinated you, stay with Echoes of Time. Next, we'll descend into the forbidden chambers of the Borgia popes, where the most powerful men of faith abandoned all restraint, and the Vatican itself became the stage for decadence.